If you understood Make America Great Again, meaning that it wasn't just expanding the profit sheet of the defense industry or cutting taxes and stimulating economic growth, but it was also addressing ourselves to the people who have been left behind, and they've been left behind in Appalachia as well as in the urban cores. And they're not all black and brown. Those people, many of them are white, maybe even most of them, who suffer the depredations of being at the bottom of American society, who are in a hole and can't get out of that hole by themselves. If that were to become a part of the Make America Great Again crusade, that to me would be a good thing.
Trump is driven by exactly two things. One, whether the leader likes him and admires him. And two, getting back at countries that he feels are not taking the knee to the United States and or not paying their way. Those are the two things. There are no other things. Those are the only two. Putin. He admires Putin because Putin is a strong kind of man and has been nice to him for the most part. And then with China, he wants to get China back. So he wants to do the tariffs. That's literally all he knows. Glenn is talking about all of these things, and the person who is leading this country and in a way the world is as short-sighted as that. That scares me.
Not everybody is black and white here. The 18th century, the 19th century, those are a long time ago. There are almost twice as many Hispanic people as blacks. The Asians have been coming for more than a half century in large numbers, and they're transforming this country. We're in the 21st century, and it's time to move on. You've reduced the people about whom you're feeling sympathetic to a status practically of animals who have no capability of governing themselves. John McWhorter of Columbia University is with me here today. I'm Glenn Loury of Brown University. This is The Glenn Show. And if you're seeing this, you're undoubtedly a paying subscriber who gets to submit questions for our monthly Q&A and gets to hear our responses to those questions. And that's what we're about today. How are you, John?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm pretty good. I'm not complaining. I'm teaching my last semester here at Brown, and it's kind of bittersweet. And I've got a seminar with 20 fresh faces, and they're eager and full of questions and comments, and it's fun. And I'm starting already to feel a little nostalgia and stuff like that.
It's good to go out like that. Yeah.
But I'm good. I'm good. We have questions here. Shall I just get to them then?
Let's do it.
All right. This is from Pat Rimell. Somewhat of a long question, but it's interesting, John. I think we'll have fun responding to it, so bear with me. For as long as I can remember, I've considered the generational poverty found in the inner city to be the single biggest moral challenge we face as a society. I used to wonder, how can we Americans tolerate this segment of our population living in conditions of low income, crime, unemployment, ineffective education, and the accompanying despair? I am in my 70s and sufficiently cynical about us as a country that I no longer wonder how we can tolerate this situation, but it still seems to me that we should not. Glenn and John, I'd like to know what you think of the following assertions in the context of generational inner city poverty. And then she has a number of bullet points, which I am about to enumerate. While there are many individuals and groups that support people in need, those supports are not adequate to address the inner city problem. Something bigger is needed. The Great Society legislation of the 60s was a, quote, big effort, but not ultimately successful. This effort can be thought of as a liberal attempt to address the problem. There is yet to be a similarly big conservative effort. The fate of people in the inner city is a function of both individual agency and the nature of their environment, supports or the lack thereof in many forms, from better schools, more and better jobs, and so on. Any solution must involve both ingredients. Any large effort to tackle this problem will be expensive, and goals will likely need to be prioritized. While generational poverty can be found in Appalachia and elsewhere, and is worthy of amelioration, slavery and later forms of subjugation and discrimination reflect the government's historical role in creating what is now the inner city problem, and therefore bring with it a higher moral debt to be paid. Reparations would not solve the problem and ignores the role of individual agency. So that's Pat Rimell, a challenge to us to react to the sequence of points that I just enumerated about inner city poverty. What do you think, John?
I hate to say that what I wrestle with is something that this writer is clearly aware of, which is that there is a such thing as a culture of poverty. It used to be that was considered a really horrible thing to say. I think less so now. But that's not to say that there haven't been societal factors that encouraged poverty, certainly. But I don't believe, and I never have believed, that once low-skill factory jobs move away, that it was inevitable that inner city Black communities fell into violence and early pregnancy and chaos. I don't think that that ever made any sense, and it's pretty much been proven that it doesn't. It's for different reasons that you end up in a situation where people are not inclined to do the kinds of things that one would do in order not to be poor. And it's not that anybody likes being poor, but people are more complicated than that. And when you read about attitudes towards work among, for example, poor Black men after the 60s, and we want to say they don't have any jobs, there aren't any jobs around, and there are people who agitate for jobs. But the gloomy truth is that in those communities, those men could work. I mean, they wouldn't be executives, but a great many of those men could work. They're jobs that they don't take. And I have full compassion for them living the only lives they've known, imitating the only peers and older family members who they've known. They live where they live and they do what they see. But they do get locked up into something like that. And then, frankly, I didn't do this on purpose, but often end up getting locked up for the same sorts of reasons. What do you consider criminal? What do you consider deviance defined downward? If you know many men who live on the other side of the law, and not just one or two, not everybody, but many, you're more likely. I have no proof of this one, but if you see many men with their hands out asking people for money, as a teenager, you're less likely to see that as an unthinkable thing for you to do, as opposed to a white kid growing up in the suburbs who would never dream of doing such a thing. Next thing you know, you've got this intergenerational poverty we're talking about. And it's not just a Black thing. You can read J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy. He's making the same argument about whites. And you know what? Glenn, I'm done.
Take your time.
Talk about public intellectual. There's a failure in this, and I feel it as a failure. But the thing is, I don't see anybody else, including people better equipped than me, having anything different. I don't think we know how to change a culture, especially because academia tells us don't say culture anyway. But it is culture. And to the extent that that would be part of solving the problem as well as society, we don't have any answers to that. And that's a nasty snag. Glenn, what do you think?
Okay, yeah, let me tell you what I think. I welcome the question. And I'm in the mood to respond in part because of the moment that we're in with a new administration and a flurry of initiatives that touch in one way or another on the race question, but don't engage the theme of Pat Rimell's question to us, that is generational poverty in the big cities, which is largely, not exclusively, but largely Black. So we're against those of us who are, like you and me, critics of affirmative action and reparations. We're against the hyper-focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion as the principal lens through which to view the issues of race and equity and equality in American society. But what do we have to say about inner city poverty? Now, you just said what you had to say, and I'm not disputing it. I want to respond by going point by point through the series of propositions that Pat Rimell has laid out to us. While there are many individuals and groups that support people in need those supports are not adequate to address the inner city problem. Something bigger is needed. I think I agree with that. Something bigger is needed, even if we don't know exactly what something bigger is. You root, John, the issue in culture. I substantially agree with that description. I don't think it's a question of opportunity alone, a question of whether the jobs are there. As the sociologist Bill Wilson has gotten famous, arguing that jobs left and with them the supports necessary to nurture the kind of behavioral nexus that would lead people to do better. You dispute that, and you and I have had our run-ins about this in the past. I'm going to stipulate that that's not the issue, because I don't think it's the main issue, even if it had historically been in the 50s and 60s. If you look at what happened to a city like Detroit, I don't see how you can avoid dealing with the implications of the decline in manufacturing, hard times of the auto steel industries and stuff like that. But I don't want to argue that with you. It's not just the economics. Something bigger is needed. But what is that thing? Pat says the Great Society was a big effort, but it was ultimately unsuccessful. I agree. The effort can be thought of as a liberal attempt to address the problem. I definitely agree. It was the liberal attempt. It was the answer. The Great Society. We were going to end poverty as we knew it. I was around as a kid in the 60s, and I remember, there was a lot of optimism and a lot of hopefulness about all the different model cities and job promotion and training and welfare expansion and all of that. And I look around, we've still got the problem. It didn't succeed. There's yet to be a similarly big conservative effort. I think that's certainly true. And I wonder if it even makes sense to talk in these terms. Does it make any sense at all to say to the Trump administration, you should mount a big effort to deal with inner city poverty? I'm not just saying because they don't believe in, trying to ameliorate the racially tinged consequences of America's past, but because the country seems to have moved on to a certain degree from that as a moral imperative. I mean, she uses the word, or he, I'm sorry, I don't know if Pat Rimell is male or female. They use the word morality. And I wonder whether or not any political weight can get behind the idea of a moral imperative to address inner city poverty in our time, given the tenor of the political climate. And I'm not just talking about Trump being indifferent to the plights of inner city Black people. That may be true, but I think the country as a whole is in a different place right now.
Our country and the world are going through an intense period of change. How we see and understand this change is largely shaped by the news we consume. With countless agendas competing for our attention, it's more important than ever to have the right tools to uncover bias, break free from big tech algorithms, and escape echo chambers. That's where Ground News comes in. It's the website and app that I rely on every day to cut through the noise, see all sides, and get closer to the truth. Check it out for yourself at ground.news/Glenn Show. My favorite feature of Ground News is the blind spot feed. It shows you stories that are disproportionately reported by either the left or the right. I find it really helpful for gaining a balanced perspective in our hyper-polarized world. To show you what I mean, here's a story that has been completely ignored by left-leaning outlets. Oxford and Cambridge to revise exam formats to improve outcomes for diverse students. Here's one with almost no coverage on the right. Education Department agrees to block Doge from accessing student data. For both of these and for every story, Ground News gives you a breakdown of the sources covering it, the bias of the media outlets reporting across the left, center, and right, how reliable these sources have been in the past, and who owns them. This is the kind of news analysis you won't find anywhere else. Right now, my viewers can get 40% off the unlimited Access Vantage plan, which is the same plan I use. Make sure you subscribe using my link at ground.news/Glenn Click the link in the description or scan the QR code when signing up. That's ground.news/Glenn.
The fate of people in the inner city is a function of both individual agency and the nature of their environment. How can that not be true? Of course it's true. Agency is important and it's ignored by many on the left. The environmental issues of, what is the economic climate, how effective are public institutions and so forth, what programmatic interventions are being promulgated and how effective are they. People can't be expected, even with the exercise of agency, to solve these kind of problems entirely on their own. There are many areas of public action, for example, the schools, which could be different and better, not just in terms of funding, but in terms of their regulation and oversight and operation. I'm in favor of charters and choice and deleveraging the influence of big cities, teachers' unions, and so on. I think the weight of the evidence favors opening the system up to alternatives and so on. That would be part of the institutional response, but there are many things. Any solution must involve both elements, I agree. Any large effort to tackle the problem will be expensive and goals will likely need to be prioritized. That seems probably right, but again, politically infeasible, expending a lot of money on addressing inner city poverty. Now, if you said expending a lot of money on making America great again, and if you understood making America great again, meaning that it wasn't just expanding the profit sheet of the defense industry or cutting taxes and stimulating economic growth, but it was also addressing ourselves to the people who have been left behind, and they've been left behind in Appalachia as well as in the urban cores. And they're not all black and brown. Those people, many of them are white, maybe even most of them who suffer the depredations of being at the bottom of American society, who are in a hole and can't get out of that hole by themselves. If that were to become a part, not the whole thing, maybe not the main thing, but a significant constituent part of the Make America Great Again crusade that Trump fancies himself at the head of, that to me would be a good thing. It'd be a good thing for the country. It wouldn't be framed in racial terms. It would be framed in a sense of what it means for America to be great. The competition with the Chinese, for example, can be understood in terms of tariffs, trade, intellectual property, aggressive bilateral competition for global leadership and in a military sense. But it could also be framed in terms of how we make the best use of our people and how we help to realize the full potential that lies within this great republic, and the extent to which the Chinese are doing a good job of educating their people, are mobilizing their human resources in an effective way, et cetera, and that we are not, are building the infrastructure, are grappling with the impediments. That is a detriment to the program of Making America Great Again, I should think. And one could see trying to ameliorate inner city poverty problems as a part, not the whole, not even the main thing, a part of a Make America Great Again, that is to say, a conservative agenda. And finally, Pat says reparations would not solve the problem and ignores the role of individual agency. And I agree with that 100%. Have said so often, I don't think it's necessary to repeat myself here.
I would also add for Pat, to give you a sense of what is meant by culture, also everybody. And I have to speak carefully on this. Over 8 years that I have lived in my neighborhood in Queens, my girls come home from school and sometimes make passing comments about a student in their class who's really just kind of a disaster, just isn't getting it. And, they're only just now becoming old enough to understand the implications of these sorts of things and to speak more carefully. But when they were too young and they were unfiltered, they would mention, And I would just, what color is that person? All 3 times it was the black kid. Usually there's one. And there's a recent example where one of mine was, talking dismissively and saying that there was this one kid who's kind of the class joke, just, can't do the math, terrible reader. And after
Excuse me, John, is this a public school?
Yes.
Mhm.
And what color is that guy? There it was. Now, I cannot see that this is an IQ issue. But I also know that given this district, there's no poverty. This person is not dealing with gunshots. Nobody's addicted to anything in his house. It's culture. It's how he has, not explicitly, but decisively been taught to think of the scholarly endeavor. And I am sure that the mothers, and if their fathers, are not saying don't do well in school. But you drink something in. What's significant? What do you care about? Who are you? What is you? What is other? We don't have any way of addressing that sort of thing. And when you can see it, even in a middle-class community like this, you know that there's something that we need to be able to get at. And unfortunately, sociologists and social psychologists are so left that they would be incapable of going at it from the perspective of what's going on within. And that's also true of our intelligentsia in general. So I worry about that, but you would have to look at it that way.
Okay. Well, Pat, Rimell, I hope you've gotten a satisfactory response from us. We've engaged you. This next question comes from Samuel D. James, and it's a question for John. And actually, John, you've answered this question previously, but the only reason I want to ask it of you again is for the way that Samuel D. James introduces the question. He writes, "Really appreciate both of you. I'm a new paying subscriber because the conversation is always compelling. Thank you both for the time and thought you put into this space."
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you very much, Samuel. Question for John. Can you take us behind the curtain a little bit on your process for writing regular columns? How do you generate your topics, capture ideas, and pace the writing? Any advice for younger writers who might aspire to something like your role?
I'm not usually that self-conscious. I just have to make myself think of myself that way. The way I come up with topics is to sit down. I actually sit down in a particular chair and I think to myself, what grabbed me this week? What interested me? What made me mad? What book did I enjoy? Or something like that. And I think to myself, would that thing work for a column? And usually it did. But the basic idea is what grabbed me. And that means going out and grabbing stuff. And so, I try to keep up with the news. I try to always be reading generally a couple books at a time, not in order to say here, I read books. I eat books. That's just me. That's not bragging. But especially these days, be reading things and a variety of things. And, you never know what will make your brain go off. Something I think I do that not everybody does is I go often with my gut. So I don't filter it in terms of what I decide I'm going to write about. What I think is interesting is this thing. And it's not something probably most people would write about, but I want to do that thing because probably people will find it more interesting than they think they might. And so that too, not thinking I'm going to write that thing someone else wrote. I'm going to write the thing that's inside of me. And that's probably a corollary of try not to say the same thing over and over again. And especially when it comes to writing about injustice. There is injustice and it does need to be called out. But I would certainly say that my process would not be that of someone who, for example, as a Black writer, thinks that the main thing they're supposed to do is write about racism. And maybe every now and then something about their kids or something. But racism in the movies, on the street, whatever. No, because someone else already did that. And the truth is that especially if you are a Black writer, I can say now from experience, if all you have to say is racism, 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 you burn out or the media gets tired of you. I've seen people like this. You have about 10 years maybe, but you have to have more. So there's that. And then in terms of the writing process, I can't really give any advice because I have a weird brain and I write really fast. The New York Times has told me I write too fast and that I need to take more time over my pieces. But if I have it my way, I can just dash it off in 45 minutes. And so I don't know. That's just a weird gift of mine. But I can definitely say this about the writing. When I dash it off in 45 minutes, the first 10 minutes is making an outline. Like, what is my sequence of argumentation going to be? And what I try to do is make an argument. That's my thing. That's my pretending that I'm a lawyer. I'm not much for exploring. I'm not that deep. What I want is to make a point. And it's what I like reading. So I guess that's the pulling back the curtain. And finally, listen to what other people say they might want to hear about it. So, for example, I have heard over and over again that I'm supposed to read this. This is Percival Everett's book, James.
I second that. You're supposed to read that book.
Including from you, Glenn.
Yeah.
And to be honest, I'm not usually a novel person. I probably read 10 novels a year. I'm not going to tell you how many nonfiction books I read a year. And frankly, I never much liked Huckleberry Finn. So I've been kind of holding off, but people keep saying there's something about the language. There's something I want to know what you think about the language. So I read James this week, and it was much better than I expected. And it also, the last thing I expected, it's going to be my next column. Well, if I hadn't read James, I wouldn't have that column. And so the idea is to also stretch yourself a little bit. Reading some novel about reimagining Jim in a book that I never really found very interesting anyway, but I'm getting against my grain.
You're going to take up this thing that Percival Everett does where James instructs the younger slaves to talk the language in a particular way so that the whites won't know that they're as wise about what's happening as they actually are.
That's where it got me. And
that's the beautiful linguistic device that he employs, I think, brilliantly.
It's really neat. Yes, slave is this other language that they speak deliberately. And when there are no white people around, they just talk standard English. Yeah, it's a good book. So yeah, but you have to stretch yourself. I didn't want to read James, but I did. So I think that's the answer to that question.
Do you know any Polish?
I know about it. Yeah.
Well, the reason I ask is because the next question comes from Tom Wojciaczyk. Wojciac.
Wojciaczyk.
ZYK.
Oh. Wojciaczyk, I think.
Sorry about that, Tom. I'm unable to pronounce your name, but I respect you. Here's the question. I have a question for John. I'm sorry, John, we're focusing on you, but this is a good one. What's the difference between an accent and pronunciation? If I visited the south side of Boston, I think he means South Boston, and heard someone talk about a pock, we all know how the stereotype goes, which I think we'd all say was their accent. I recently read a book where the author went to American Samoa, and he was explaining how we all mispronounce Samoa as Samoa when it should be Samoa.
Samoa, yeah.
How is this not attributed to their accent versus pronunciation? When someone says caramel, and what they mean is caramel, is that a mispronunciation or simply an accent?
Accent refers to the color of your vowels and your consonants and things that you do to sounds or don't do to them, such as leaving out the R, etc. And so in any language spoken by more than 2 or 3 people, there are going to be variant ways of pronouncing things. And the conventions of pronunciation among your group are what we call accent. Now, there are often differing pronunciations of a word that don't have a whole lot to do with different groups, but it's just that some people say caramel, some people say caramel. I think I've often said both. So those are variant pronunciations that aren't really about ethnicity or region or something like that. When it comes to Samoa, the issue there is that they speak the Samoan language, as we say in American English, and their sound system is different from ours in terms of where they tend to put the accent, so to speak. And linguists don't call that accent. We call it the stress, the strong syllable, where you put the stress in words. That is not their accent in English. That is about their language, Samoan, which is related to Hawaiian and Maori and is absolutely nothing like English. There might be a Samoan English. As a matter of fact, maybe there is. But saying Samoa would be because that's how you say it in the native language, as opposed to it being a particularity of how English is spoken there to the extent that it is.
So what is mispronunciation?
Mispronunciation, and it's a fine line. If you're the only person saying something in a certain way, or there are only 2 or 3 people saying it in a certain way, well, then it's not a norm, and you might want to get with the program. So, for example, albeit. I thought that word was pronounced albeit until I was in my 30s. I thought it was a German word. That's just wrong. I probably am not the only person who's thought that. It's just wrong. Or with great compassion, but it was a perfect example. My mother talked like me. People who knew her say you sound just like her. But she had a quirk in her pronunciation. I have one too. I don't say were, I say war. They war over there. She had one. For no reason at all. I think this was just chance. She said grocery instead of grocery. And there was nothing wrong with her teeth. She was from the deep South. That is not a Southern pronunciation. Grocery and nerfree. I never knew why. And as I grew up, once I was around 9, I realized no one says that but her. For some reason, she mispronounced those 2 words. That was a mispronunciation because nobody else goes to the nursery to get flowers. But if there were like 1 in 3 people who said it that way, then we would have, like with caramel and caramel, alternate pronunciation. Where do you draw the line? Of course, there isn't one. But in terms of degree, mispronunciation is when you're just doing it wrong. And if the truth is that 1 out of 2 people pronounce it in a certain way and it's still being called a mispronunciation, it shouldn't be. So that is the basic answer to that question.
I'm thinking about the woman whose name I don't recall, who does the NPR show on the weekends, who has a...
Aisha Roscoe? Aisha Roscoe with a very strong accent? Yeah.
Yeah. She has a African-American accent, you could say, but she doesn't mispronounce. And what I mean by that is while you note the accent, her erudition, her command of the language is quite clear. I mean, she's a thoughtful, well-expressed person, as is fitting to the position that she has as a broadcaster. To preclude her from broadcasting because of the accent, it seems to me would be wrong. It would be, in another way, interpreting the accented variation as mispronunciation and misuse of the language, and I think that would be a mistake. And somehow in there, I think, is the core of an answer to the question at hand. It's like there is variation in the way people pronounce words. That's just a fact about linguistic reality. But what we want is not a deviation that is indicative of a failure to have command of the language or something. I don't quite have this, but I'm gesturing in a direction I think that one might want to go to.
Aisha Roscoe is a very good example because her hiring and being put in that position pushes the envelope. I think it's healthy that listeners have to get used to hearing somebody with a very strong, what I call black accent, which she's making no effort to suppress, which Black radio commentators still are to an extent. But she just, she didn't get that memo, and yet America listens to her week after week. I should say, folks, that I did a podcast episode about exactly her. My show, Lexicon Valley, I did a whole episode about why she talks the way she does and why it's not wrong for her to be on the radio and how we need to get used to voices like hers. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned her, Glenn.
Yeah, there's something, not to make the anti-DEI people mad at me, inclusive about hearing her voice at NPR.
That's a perfect dead-on explanation. Yeah.
John and I often talk about higher education on this podcast, obviously. That's the universe we both inhabit. And why not? It's a topic that has moved front and center of late at both the state and national level.
free speech on campus, viewpoint diversity on campus, cancel culture on campus, soaring tuition, affirmative action, race-based admissions, accreditation, the erosion of standards, attacks on the classics, hiring litmus tests, critical race theory, diversity, equity, and inclusion. You name it, it's in the news. So, with all that's going on, and there's a lot going on, to whom can one turn as a trusted resource of all issues related to campus reform, whether you're a student, faculty, trustee, administrator, donor, policymaker, or alumni? One source we want you to know about and strongly recommend as a credible and respected voice on all these issues is the American Council of Trustees and Alumni, or ACTA, whom we're pleased to have supporting this episode. ACTA is on the front lines, promoting academic excellence, academic freedom, and accountability at America's colleges and universities. They don't just serve as trusted advisors to college trustees and alumni, they help arm reformers with resources, ideas, recommendations, information, even grassroots alumni support through their Campus Freedom Initiative. They make positive changes happen, and they approach these issues in a nonpartisan, balanced, informed, highly credible way, which we appreciate. If you care deeply about these issues, as John and I do, you really must know more about the American Council of Trustees and Alumni. Start by looking them up on the web at goacta.org. That's goacta.org. And follow them on Twitter and Facebook.
Good.
All right, take a few more questions. The next one is from Michael. Has it been for so long that you both have forgotten the Cold War? Trump very clearly wants to break down the post-Cold War global order of the past 30 years, and I sense that both of you, or at least Glenn, are sympathetic to that. It also seems very clear that Trump has a worldview based on great power competition and spheres of influence, and he seems willing, if not eager, to step aside and allow Russia and China to rise as global powers by backing away from our long-term allies in Europe and Asia. It seems like a return to the global order that we left behind in 1989 when we rightly celebrated its demise. Glenn sometimes talks about his concerns of nuclear war, but if we return to another Cold War with three great powers seeking territorial expansion, that seems like it will eventually raise, not lower, the risk of nuclear exchange. Are either of you even a little bit worried? Well, let me go first, John, since I elected to put this question before us, and I didn't get your permission. I mean, the Cold War is over, but the world is not a unipolar world. The world is a multipolar world, and I think that needs to be accommodated and accepted as opposed to fought against and railed against. I think the rise of China is a geopolitical fact. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing for the world. I certainly think it's not a bad thing for those people in China who are being brought within the modern world because of the successful transformation of a country of 1.5 billion people. So I don't fear the onset of a new world order. I do have some sympathy for Trump's desire to unburden America of the responsibility of being the world's policeman. It's costly. I mean, I don't know how you read Iraq and Afghanistan as not you, John, you, Michael, read Iraq and Afghanistan as military ventures. I read them as disastrous in terms of lost treasure and the accomplishment of the stated goals. I fear war with Iran, frankly, as a catastrophic venture, both for the global economy and in the spirit of Iraq and Afghanistan for the U.S. taxpayer, military, and so forth. I understand it's complicated. The nuclear proliferation problem, the confrontation with Israel that Iran insists on pursuing, and our large interest in cultivating commodious relations with the Sunni Arab Gulf states and Saudi Arabia and so on, and who are arrayed against Iran. And it's complicated. And I have to confess that I'm not an expert in this area, but slow to go to the ramparts, slow to the barricades, slow to mobilization, slow to conflict, which can get out of hand. And yes, I think I agree with your colleague, John, at Columbia, Jeffrey Sachs, the economist, when he says the main foreign policy imperative for the president is to avoid nuclear war because of the catastrophic consequences should it happen, and the very real prospect that big power confrontation can get out of hand. We definitely don't want nuclear war. That is a terrible thing. Now, I was trained in game theory as an economist, and I get the idea that just because an outcome is bad doesn't mean you need to conduct yourself so as to make the probability of that outcome zero. Because other bad things are also bad, and they may happen with greater frequency to the extent that you avoid, so for example, the Russians in Ukraine, how do you deal with the confrontation that is ongoing there? If you were to conduct yourself with the principal objective of minimizing the chance of nuclear war, you basically step aside and let them do what they wanted to do. We're already well advanced in Ukraine by now, and that's a whole nother subject that wasn't raised in the question. And Trump promises to end that conflict one way or another, and I'm for that, and I'm partly for that because I don't want nuclear war. On the other hand, I wouldn't have counseled non-involvement in reaction to the Russian aggression there because it raises the probability of nuclear war, which it certainly does do. But that would have been the wrong way of reacting. Still, one wants to bear in mind things can get out of hand, and that can be a problem. Either you're a little bit worried. Yeah, I'm a little bit worried, but I'm a little bit worried about war with Iran. I'm a little bit worried about neocon hawks leading us over the edge of the cliff, as much as I'm worried about the rise of China or the fact that the Russian empire, the Russian sphere of influence might preclude Ukraine joining NATO.
I don't have much to add, Glenn, except that however we feel about a new and possibly more dangerous Cold War, what I'm more afraid of is who we have in power. And I'm counting it down. We've got 3 years, 11 months, and 2 weeks to go of this. But frankly, Trump is driven by exactly two things. One, whether the leader likes him and admires him. And two, getting back at countries that he feels are not taking the knee to the United States and or not paying their way.
Not carrying their own weight, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Those are the two things. There are no other things. Those are the only two. It's interesting with Trump. To me, he's like the way we solve problems in linguistics, and you try to see what very few things end up creating a big mess of other things. Or it's kind of like how one gene on the chromosome can do all sorts of things, not just one thing. With Trump, it all comes down to those two things. So Putin, he admires Putin because Putin is a strong kind of man and has been nice to him for the most part. And then with China, he wants to get China back. And so he wants to do the tariffs. That's literally all he knows. So Glenn is talking about all of these things. And the person who is leading this country and in a way the world is as short-sighted as that. That scares me more than something as abstract as, are we entering another Cold War? I can't wait until the person who's president would be in a position to address a question such as yours.
All right. We're stuck with him for at least 4 years, John.
3 years, 11 months, and 2 weeks more.
Next question. Believe me, listeners, we're going to help John endure the next 3 years, 11 months, and 2 weeks. We're going to get through it somehow. He will not have to do it alone.
Oh, Lord, help me.
Next question is from it's from Karen Dawn Norris. Dear Professors Loury and McWhorter, I mentioned this question in another post, but I will present it formally here. Both of you have opposed reparations in the past for slightly different reasons. Professor Loury doesn't want a handout, while Professor McWhorter feels that they've already been rendered via various government programs such as affirmative action and the Community Reinvestment Act. However, in my view, reparations serve two purposes. One is to compensate the formerly injured parties, while the other is to expiate guilt on the part of the oppressors. So, supposing a critical mass of people whose ancestors were oppressors said, quote, we feel a need to both expiate guilt and formally uphold the moral stance that we repudiate the former behavior and declare that it is not who we are as a society any longer. Would you deprive the guilty of the opportunity to redeem themselves?
Glenn, I'm going to leave this to you because my answer remains. All of that already happened. However, Glenn, from your perspective, so.
Yeah, let me respond from my perspective, and I don't want to get into a dispute with you about whether or not the expansion of welfare is reparations to Black people, because it was not just Black people, but that's a separate point.
Well, everything, affirmative action, all Community Reinvestment Act, that was it. Anyway, go ahead.
Okay, I'm fine. I don't have an opinion about that, or none that I'm willing to express. What I want to say is, she asked, would I stand in the way of the guilty expiating their sense of guilt and taking a moral stance to repudiate the former behavior and declare that it's not who we are any longer? Yeah, I would stand in the way of you doing that. If you're doing it at the expense of my dignity, if you're making me into an object of your sympathy, and not seeing that I need to stand up straight with my shoulders back and take responsibility for my life. To be the recipient of your largesse so that you can feel better about having given it? Yeah, I'd stand in the way of that. And I'll just reiterate my objections to reparations, which is not that it's racial reparations because of the depredations of slavery and Jim Crow segregation, which is not that it is an appropriate response to history which has already been executed, but rather that it's a completely inappropriate response to history to racialize this situation and to visit the sins of the fathers upon the sons. You make not only the recipients into wards who you are beneficent enough to bestow reparations upon, you racialize the entire discussion in a country where we should be moving beyond that. Not everybody is black and white here. The 18th century, the 19th century, those are a long time ago. There are almost twice as many Hispanic people as Blacks. The Asians have been coming for more than a half century in large numbers, and they're transforming this country. We're in the 21st century, and it's time to move on. It's a South Africa apartheid-esque mentality that would classify American citizens on the basis of race and then bestow benefits on them justified by a narrative about American history that is one-dimensional. So, yeah, I object to reparations. And yeah, I would stand in the way of your expiating your sense of guilt. And I would ask, frankly, what that sense of guilt is actually about. Do you really feel responsible for fatherless homes and violent criminality in the inner city? Do you really think that's your fault? You've elevated yourself practically to the status of a god, and you've reduced the people about whom you're feeling sympathetic to a status practically of animals who have no capability of governing themselves. So I object. Final question. From young Törless, a frequent contributor to the Q&A. We've picked his questions in the past because of their excellence, and this is no exception. On January 6th episode of The Glenn Show entitled seismic sociopolitical shift, you and John discussed the issue regarding immigrants and culture. At one point, John actually used the term white culture. He subsequently modified it by saying, quote, whatever that is. You then responded by saying, quote, all of this discussion about culture gives me the willies. I'll have to admit, when John said white culture, it alarmed me. Only two groups of people actively define white culture today, white supremacists and anti-racists, both of whom assert the belief that race is not malleable and essential. That stated, you and John both ascribe to a belief in, quote, blackness, and what may be defined as, quote, black culture. Here is a little experiment. If you and John were in a room with, say, 5 more individuals of African descent, could you all agree on the same definition of blackness, apart from just skin tone? For example, let's say the 7 individuals were you, John, Al Sharpton, Charles Barkley, Condoleezza Rice, Raven-Symone, and Iman, the supermodel, whom I never heard of. Could you all agree on one definite characteristic of blackness and or black culture apart from simply skin tone as a mark of oppression? Good question.
I do not remember that part of the exchange specifically, but white culture was not properly put. What I did mean was mainstream culture. And yes, I think the default sense of that has a white face, but mainstream culture, which is partaken of by people of all colors to various extents. Is there such thing as black culture? Yes, Black American culture. And when we were referring to it, I believe what we were talking about was a kind of a dusted lightly aspect of it in terms of what music you like, in terms of what food you like, in terms of how humor works, etc. And those things are real. There are people who are uncomfortable saying so, but there is a such thing. Now, black culture in terms of black skin, I think we all know, of course not. Now, with the people that you had in that room, talking about short-term memory. So it's me, Glenn, it's Al Sharpton, Condoleezza Rice, Charles Barkley, Iman.
Raven-Symone.
Oh, Raven-Symone. All those people but Iman do have a certain something in common. If those 6 people were in a room, there would be certain jokes made, a certain temper to laughter, a certain way of listening to music, certain musical experiences, all the way from Raven-Symone to Al Sharpton through me. Yeah. Now, Iman would be very much the person out. Iman has really nothing in common with the rest of us except for, melanin. And, she's actually part of that Ethiopia, Eritrea, Djibouti realm who are kind of separate even among most Africans. So, no, not Iman, but Black American culture. Yeah, it exists very much so. It's not ghetto misbehavior. That's not what I meant by black culture, but it's knowing who Gladys Knight and the Pips were, or any number of things.
Yeah, I think I agree. I think young Törless has a point that there's a tendency to essentialize along racial lines when we're talking about culture that should be resisted. But I think in the same way that if you were to say, what is Greek American culture or what is Irish American culture, you would be able to put your hands on certain things. What kind of music, what kind of food, what jokes they laugh at, linguistic peculiarities, narratives. What history do they tell themselves when they're reading bedtime stories to their children? How do they worship? You can't go to a black church worship service, a Baptist church, an African Methodist Episcopal church, listen to a sermon, hear the choir sing, watch the reaction of the congregation, and not think that you're in the presence of something that resonates, cultural something, or something that goes back generations, that is peculiar to the experience of the descendants of slaves. And so I think there's something there, but I think you have to be careful. But the world is fast moving. I grant the implicit point here, which is that it's not a stable, static circumstance. And in American society, what with the influx of people from all over the planet, what with Jamaican immigrants and Nigerian immigrants and whatnot, what one means by blackness is constantly being influenced by currents that are ongoing. So, I agree. But let me put it like this: when I read that the Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture had put out a memo or a posting or something like that in which they identified certain features of white culture, like punctuality, thinking that there are right answers to math questions and things like that, I thought, come on.
Respect for the written word.
Yeah. Come on. That is horrible. First of all, by essentializing this in racial terms, and secondly, by implicitly saying Black people don't do these things and it's okay too because it's not their culture. And I thought that was a terrible essentializing a move in terms of cultural discourse. So I think there is something to be concerned about in young Törless's question. But I think blackness, if by blackness, what I mean is in the presence of these people, I'm reminded of my upbringing on the South Side of Chicago because they know who Marvin Gaye is and et cetera. Wear it lightly is kind of my answer. I mean, it's a flavor, it's a seasoning. It's not the main. It's not the main nutrient of our life or our existence, but it is a seasoning. It varies amongst various subpopulations of the country, and the South Side of Chicago is a real place. It has its rhythms and so on, and
Glenn, I want to add that the person who put together that Smithsonian poster was a white woman. She felt
I didn't know that.
She felt Judith something. She felt she was doing the right thing. And, to bring this full circle, that thing you say about the seasoning, going back to one of those early questions, if you're trying to be a writer and you're a writer of color, don't think that the only thing you have to contribute to the world is to write about the seasoning. Try other stuff. There are all sorts of things about you that are individual, and people will be as interested to hear about those things as they want to hear about your seasonings, so to speak. Just something to think about.
All right. I'm going to call it quits. John, you okay with that?
I'm okay with that. I have to write about James now.
This has been Glenn and John, our monthly Q&A. Thank you for subscribing to The Glenn Show at Substack.com. We really appreciate your support. Come back next month for the Q&A. Come back next week for me and John talking about this and that. Glenn Loury signing out here. Thank you.
See you later, folks.